Picture this: American B-2 stealth bombers are being prepped for deployment. Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders are moving underground, and diplomatic cables between Tehran and Washington are flying faster than missiles. But here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. What happens when the world's most powerful military faces off against a nation that spent 40 years preparing for exactly this moment? What happens when diplomacy has a deadline, and that deadline is measured in hours, not days? The clock is ticking, and what unfolds in the next 72 hours could reshape the entire Middle East. This isn't speculation. This is happening right now. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Right now, at this very moment, Iran is operating under its highest state of military readiness since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. But unlike that crisis, which erupted suddenly and subsided quickly, this situation is different. This is a slow burning fuse attached to a powder keg that's been accumulating explosive material for decades. Iranian officials aren't just worried about military strikes. They're watching the diplomatic chessboard with the intensity of players who know that one wrong move could trigger a cascade of events that no one can control. The question everyone in Tehran, Washington, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh is asking is simple but terrifying: is war inevitable, or can diplomacy pull the region back from the brink one more time? Let me take you inside what's actually happening behind the closed doors of power, because the public statements you're seeing on the news are just the tip of an iceberg that goes down much, much deeper. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian has been working the phones like never before, reaching out to counterparts in Russia, China, Turkey, and even European nations that have maintained frosty relations with Tehran for years. These aren't courtesy calls. These are desperate attempts to build a diplomatic firewall, a coalition of voices that might convince Washington to think twice before launching military operations. But here's what makes this situation particularly dangerous. Iran is simultaneously pursuing diplomacy while also making very public displays of military capability, sending mixed signals that could easily be misinterpreted in a crisis. The United States has made its position crystal clear through a series of strategic deployments that speak louder than any press conference ever could. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, which had been operating in the Mediterranean, has now moved into a position where its aircraft can reach Iranian territory within minutes. Additional F-35 stealth fighters have been quietly deployed to bases in the region, their presence confirmed by satellite imagery that defense analysts have been poring over like ancient texts. B-52 Stratofortress bombers, capable of carrying massive conventional payloads, have conducted highly publicized flight paths near Iranian airspace, a classic demonstration of power meant to send an unmistakable message. But here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. These aren't the only preparations happening. What you don't see on the news are the cyber warfare units that have been activated, the signals intelligence assets that are now focused on Iranian communications like a laser, and the special operations forces that have been put on standby for contingencies that the Pentagon won't discuss publicly. The United States military doesn't move these kinds of assets into position for show. Every deployment costs millions of dollars and represents a strategic commitment. When you see this level of military mobilization, you're watching the preliminary steps of a carefully choreographed operation that could be launched at a moment's notice. The question isn't whether America has the capability to strike Iran. Everyone knows the answer to that is an overwhelming yes. The question is whether the political will exists to pull the trigger, and what Iran might do in the desperate hours before that trigger is pulled. Now, let's talk about what Iran has been doing while all of this is unfolding, because this is where the situation becomes truly complex. Iran is in Iraq in 2003 or Libya in 2011. This is a nation that has spent 40 years, an entire generation, preparing for confrontation with the United States. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which operates parallel to the regular military, has developed what defense analysts call an asymmetric warfare doctrine. They know they can't match American firepower conventionally, so they've built an entire military strategy around making any attack on Iran so costly, so complicated, and so unpredictable that it would give even the most hawkish Pentagon planners serious pause. Think swarms of fast attack boats in the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil passes every single day. Think ballistic missiles hidden in underground facilities that even the most advanced bunker buster bombs might not be able to reach. Think proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen that could activate within hours, turning the entire region into a battlefield. But here's what makes this moment particularly dangerous, and this is something that even seasoned Middle East experts are struggling to fully understand. Iran is signaling that it wants a diplomatic solution while simultaneously positioning its military forces in ways that suggest they're preparing for the worst case scenario. Iranian naval forces have increased their patrol activities in the Persian Gulf. Mobile missile launchers have been dispersed from their normal storage locations, making them harder to target in a first strike. Air defense systems, including the Russian-made S-300 platforms, have been activated and are scanning the skies continuously. If you're a military planner in Washington looking at this intelligence, you have to ask yourself a crucial question. Is Iran preparing to defend itself, or is it preparing to strike first? The answer to that question could determine whether we wake up tomorrow to news of explosions in Tehran or continued tense negotiations. The diplomatic push that Iranian officials are mounting right now is unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Iran's president has given interviews to international media, something that doesn't happen unless the situation is genuinely critical. The message from Tehran is carefully calibrated. We don't want war. We're ready to negotiate, but we will defend ourselves if attacked. Iranian diplomats have been offering various compromise proposals, suggesting everything from renewed nuclear negotiations to regional security arrangements that might address American concerns about Iranian influence. But here's the problem that keeps coming up in every diplomatic channel: trust. The United States doesn't trust Iranian promises, pointing to years of what they characterize as malign activities across the region. Iran doesn't trust American intentions, remembering the unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018 and the assassination of their top general. When two sides don't trust each other but need to find a way to avoid catastrophic conflict, diplomacy becomes less about finding common ground and more about managing a crisis minute by minute. Think about the human element of what's happening right now, because these aren't just military units and diplomatic cables. These are real people making decisions under incredible pressure. In Tehran, there are families stocking up on emergency supplies, remembering the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, when cities were bombed and millions died. There are Iranian military commanders who understand that their decisions in the coming hours might determine whether their nation survives intact or becomes the next target American military power. There are diplomats working 18-hour days trying to thread an almost impossible needle between showing strength and offering compromise. Every decision is fraught with danger. Every statement could be the one that pushes the situation over the edge. And all of this is happening while the rest of the world watches nervously, knowing that a war between the United States and Iran wouldn't stay contained. It would ripple across the global economy, energy markets, and regional stability in ways that would affect every person on the planet. Let me tell you about the regional dynamics that are making this situation even more complicated, because Iran doesn't exist in a vacuum. Israel is watching these developments with hawk-like intensity, and Israeli officials have made it clear that they view Iranian nuclear capabilities and regional influence as existential threats. If the United States launches military operations against Iran, does Israel join in? If Israel joins in, how does that change the calculus for Iranian response? Saudi Arabia, which has been locked in a regional Cold War with Iran for decades, is suddenly showing signs of wanting to de-escalate tensions, having recently restored diplomatic relations with Tehran through Chinese mediation. But would Saudi Arabia allow American forces to use bases on Saudi territory for strikes on Iran? The Saudis are trying to balance their security relationship with Washington against their desire not to become targets of Iranian retaliation. Turkey, a NATO member, but also a nation that has maintained complex relationships with Iran, is calling for restraint and offering to mediate. Russia and China, both of which have significant interests in Iran and serious concerns about American military operations in their sphere of influence, are issuing stern warnings about the consequences of military action. This is where it gets really interesting from a strategic perspective. The United States is operating with a coalition of informal partners, but this isn't like the Gulf War in 1991, where you had a clear international mandate and broad regional support. This is much murkier. If American forces strike Iran, they might be doing so with limited international backing and serious questions about the legal justification. That might not stop military operations. The United States has launched strikes before without UN approval, but it changes the diplomatic environment and potentially the sustainability of any military campaign. And Iran knows this. Iranian strategists understand that if they can make an American military operation look like aggression rather than justified retaliation, they can shift international opinion and potentially split whatever coalition the United States is trying to hold together. Now let's talk about what a military confrontation would actually look like, because Hollywood and video games have given people a very distorted view of modern warfare. If the United States decides to launch military operations against Iran, the first wave would almost certainly involve stealth aircraft and cruise missiles targeting Iranian air defense systems, command and control facilities, and missile sites. This is what military planners call establishing air superiority. You need to own the skies before you can conduct sustained operations. But Iran has prepared for exactly this scenario. They've built redundant command systems, hardened critical facilities underground, and dispersed their most valuable assets. The Iranian strategy would be to absorb the first strike, survive it, and then respond with whatever capabilities remain intact. That response could take multiple forms: ballistic missiles targeting American bases across the region, attacks on oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, mining the Strait of Hormuz to disrupt global oil supplies, and activation of proxy forces to attack American personnel and interests across Iraq, Syria, and potentially beyond. Here's the scenario that keeps defense analysts awake at night. The United States launches what it intends to be a limited military operation, maybe taking out specific nuclear facilities or missile sites. Iran responds by attacking American forces in Iraq and an oil facility in Saudi Arabia. Oil prices spiked to over $150 a barrel within hours as markets panic about the Strait of Hormuz being closed. The United States conducts a second wave of strikes, this time targeting more Iranian military infrastructure. Iran launches ballistic missiles at American bases, and one of them gets through the defenses, killing American service members. Now the United States is facing domestic pressure to escalate, while Iran is facing domestic pressure not to back down. Where does it stop? How do you de-escalate once you've crossed certain thresholds? This is the terrifying logic of escalation, where each side responds to the other in ways that make the conflict larger and more destructive until it bears no resemblance to the limited operation anyone originally envisioned. But here's what I want you to understand about the diplomatic efforts that are happening right now, because this is where there's still hope, fragile as it might be. Behind the scenes, away from the cameras and the tough public statements, there are people on both sides who understand the catastrophic consequences of getting this wrong. There are back-channel communications happening through intermediaries, careful discussions about what it would take to step back from the brink. The Swiss, who represent American interests in Iran since the two nations don't have formal diplomatic relations, are facilitating some of these conversations. The United Nations is involved, with the Secretary General personally reaching out to both Tehran and Washington. Oman, which has historically played a mediator role between Iran and the West, is reportedly hosting quiet discussions between officials who can't be seen talking to each other publicly. These diplomatic efforts might seem futile when you look at the military deployments and the harsh rhetoric, but they represent the only real path away from a conflict that nobody truly wants, but that many seem to be sleepwalking toward. The economic dimension of this crisis is absolutely critical and doesn't get nearly enough attention. Iran's economy is already under tremendous pressure from American sanctions that have been described as some of the most comprehensive ever imposed on a nation. The Iranian currency has collapsed, inflation is running rampant, and ordinary Iranians are struggling with the cost of basic goods. Iranian officials are keenly aware that their domestic political survival depends partly on whether they can deliver some kind of economic relief, which means they need sanctions relief, which means they need a deal with the United States. But American officials are equally aware that the sanctions are causing pain in Iran, and they see that pain as leverage to force Iranian concessions on nuclear development and regional behavior. This creates a dynamic where both sides have incentives to negotiate, but also incentives to hold out for better terms. And that dangerous game of chicken is happening while military forces are mobilized and ready for action. Iranian officials are making a calculated bet right now that the United States doesn't actually want a full-scale war, that the deployment of military forces is meant to intimidate rather than as a genuine prelude to attack. They're betting that if they can combine just enough diplomatic flexibility with just enough demonstration of military capability, they can navigate through this crisis without either surrendering their core interests or triggering American military action. It's an incredibly high stakes gamble. If they're right, Iran survives this crisis, possibly even emerges with some diplomatic wins. If they're wrong, if they miscalculate American intentions, or if some unexpected incident triggers a military response, then all of their careful planning goes out the window, and they're facing the full weight of American military power. Would you want to be the Iranian official making that calculation right now, knowing that your decision might determine the fate of your entire nation? From the American perspective, the challenge is equally daunting. Yes, the United States has overwhelming military superiority. Yes, American forces could inflict devastating damage on Iranian military capabilities. But then what? Military operations are the easy part. It's what comes after that's complicated. If the United States strikes Iran, is it prepared for a long-term confrontation that could last years? Is it prepared for oil prices that could trigger a global recession? Is it prepared for increased instability across the entire Middle East, potentially undoing whatever limited gains have been made in places like Iraq? Is it prepared for the possibility that military action might actually accelerate Iranian nuclear development rather than stopping it As Iran decides it needs nuclear weapons to deter future attacks, these are the questions that serious military planners are asking, and they don't have easy answers. The fact that these deployments have happened, but strikes haven't been launched yet, suggests that someone in Washington is thinking very carefully about these complications. Let me tell you what the next 72 hours are likely to bring, because this situation is extremely fluid and could change rapidly. Diplomatic channels are going to be working overtime, with messages passing back and forth through various intermediaries as both sides try to find a face-saving way to de-escalate. Iranian officials will be looking for some signal from Washington that gives them space to back down without appearing weak domestically. American officials will be looking for concrete Iranian actions, maybe reducing certain military activities or making specific commitments on nuclear issues that would justify postponing or canceling military operations. The danger is that while these careful diplomatic dances are happening, something unexpected could occur. A miscommunication, an accidental clash between military forces, a hardliner on either side deciding to force the issue. Any of these could be the spark that ignites the powder keg. This is why high alert situations are so dangerous. Everyone is on edge, everyone is ready to respond to perceived threats, and the margin for error becomes razor thin. Think about the intelligence picture that both sides are dealing with right now. American intelligence agencies are monitoring Iranian communications, watching troop movements via satellite, analyzing every signal they can collect to determine Iranian intentions. Are the Iranians really preparing for diplomacy, or is this a deception while they ready themselves for a first strike? Iranian intelligence is doing the same thing in reverse, trying to determine whether American military deployments are genuine preparations for attack or psychological warfare meant to force concessions. Both sides are operating with incomplete information, trying to read signals that might be deliberately misleading, making life or death decisions based on intelligence assessments that could be wrong. This is the reality of modern geopolitical crisis management. It's not the clear-cut scenarios you see in movies. It's murky, ambiguous, and filled with uncertainty. The role of domestic politics in both countries cannot be ignored. In the United States, there are political constituencies that have been pushing for a harder line on Iran for years, arguing that only military force will truly change Iranian behavior. There are others who believe that military action would be a catastrophic mistake, pointing to the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. President Biden is navigating between these competing pressures while also dealing with a divided Congress and upcoming elections that will shape how much political capital he can spend on foreign policy. In Iran, there's an equally complex political landscape. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has final say on security matters, but he's also watching domestic discontent, economic struggles, and questions about the regime's legitimacy. Iranian leaders need to appear strong and defiant to their hardline base, while also pursuing pragmatic diplomacy to avoid a catastrophic war. Neither American nor Iranian leaders are operating in a vacuum. They're responding to domestic political realities that sometimes push them toward confrontation, even when cooler strategic calculations might suggest restraint. Here's something that should terrify you about modern warfare that most people don't think about. If the United States and Iran do end up in military conflict, it won't just be conventional forces clashing. We're talking about cyber warfare that could disrupt critical infrastructure, potentially affecting everything from power grids to financial systems. We're talking about information warfare and propaganda campaigns designed to shape international opinion and domestic morale. We're talking about the possibility of attacks on civilian infrastructure that would create humanitarian crises. Modern warfare between technologically capable nations is incredibly destructive in ways that go far beyond traditional bombs and bullets. Iranian cyber capabilities are not to be underestimated. They've demonstrated sophisticated attacks on American banks and even penetrated some industrial control systems. An Iranian cyber response to American military strikes could affect Americans far from any battlefield, potentially disrupting services and infrastructure that people depend on every day. The humanitarian dimension is something that gets lost in all the strategic analysis and military planning. If war breaks out, it's not generals and politicians who suffer most, it's ordinary people. Iranian civilians who have nothing to do with their government's policies would face bombing campaigns and economic collapse. American service members, many of them young men and women barely out of high school, would be put in harm's way. People across the region, Iraqis, Syrians, Lebanese, Yemenis, would potentially be drawn into a wider conflict that they had no say in starting. Oil price spikes would affect people around the world, making it harder to afford fuel and increasing the cost of virtually everything since transportation costs factor into all goods. This isn't abstract geopolitics. These are real human consequences that should weigh heavily on anyone making decisions about war and peace. So where does this leave us right now at this critical moment? Iran is on high alert. Its military forces positioned for potential conflict while its diplomats work desperately to avoid that outcome. The United States has deployed overwhelming military power to the region, sending an unmistakable signal while leaving just enough ambiguity about intentions to keep diplomatic channels open. The world is watching nervously, hoping that somehow, despite all the tension and mistrust and historical baggage, cooler heads will prevail. The next 72 hours are absolutely critical. Decisions made in Washington, Tehran, and other capitals in the coming days will determine whether we look back on this as a crisis successfully managed or as the beginning of a conflict that reshapes the Middle East and potentially the entire global order. This is the moment where diplomacy either succeeds or fails. This is where we find out whether the international system has mechanisms strong enough to prevent wars that nobody really wants, but that circumstances seem to be pushing everyone toward. The Iranian officials pushing diplomacy right now are fighting against history, against mistrust, against hardliners in their own government who think military strength is the only language America understands. The American officials considering whether to launch strikes are weighing incredibly complex factors: strategic, political, humanitarian, economic, trying to determine the right course of action when every option carries enormous risks. We are living through a genuine historical moment, one of those hinge points where the decisions made now will be studied and debated for decades to come. You need to understand that what happens next isn't predetermined. This isn't some inevitable march toward conflict. Human beings are making choices right now that will determine the outcome. Diplomacy could still work. A compromise could still be found. Leaders could still step back from the brink. But it requires political courage, creative problem solving, and a willingness to take risks for peace rather than sleepwalking into war. The Iranian officials pursuing diplomatic solutions need international support and domestic political space to make necessary compromises. American policymakers need to recognize that military solutions to complex political problems rarely work out as cleanly as the initial battle plans suggest. The international community needs to step up and provide mediation guarantees and pressure on both sides to choose negotiation over confrontation. Here's my call to action for you. Stay informed about what's happening. Don't just read headlines. Dig deeper into the complexities of this situation. Understand that these aren't simple good guys versus bad guys scenarios, but complicated situations where legitimate security concerns clash with political realities and historical grievances. If you're an American, let your elected representatives know that you care about these issues and that you want thoughtful, strategic approaches rather than rush to military action. If you're anywhere else in the world, recognize that what happens between the United States and Iran affects global stability and economic security in ways that will touch your life. This isn't someone else's problem happening far away. This is a crisis with worldwide implications that demands worldwide attention. The stakes could not be higher. We're talking about war or peace, stability or chaos, a managed crisis, or a catastrophic conflict. The decisions being made right now in Tehran, Washington, and other capitals around the world will echo for years to come. Pay attention, stay alert, demand accountability from leaders making these critical choices. The next chapter of this story is being written right now, and we all have a stake in how it ends. Don't look away. This is too important.